Welcome to Galaxy Brains.
An infinite amount of cash.
I'm your host, Alex Thorn.
The U.S. banking system is sound and resilient.
Bitcoin made a new all-time high.
If you're not long, you're short.
Satoshi's going to come on there, laugh hysterically, go quiet. All Bitcoin's going to be erased.
Bitcoin's the best crypto out there.
Bitcoin is going to zero.
Welcome back to Galaxy Brains. As always, I'm your host, Alex Thorn, head of firm-wide research at Galaxy. Bitcoin not zero, and we have a great episode for you today. Jake Chervinsky, chief legal officer at Variant Fund, former chief policy officer at the Blockchain Association, is our guest. We're going to talk about all the crazy digital asset policy stuff going on, the crypto summit happening at the White House this week. What is the biggest existential threat to Bitcoin and crypto and digital assets that still remains? And of course, we'll check with our good friend Beimnet Abebe from Galaxy Trading, as always, to talk about markets. Before we get to that, I need to remind you to please refer to the link to the disclaimer in the podcast notes and note that none of the information in this podcast constitutes investment advice or an offer, recommendation, or solicitation by Galaxy or any of its affiliates to buy or sell any securities. Let's hop right into the show. Let's go now to our friend Beimnet Abebe from Galaxy Trading. As always, Beimnet, welcome back to Galaxy Brains.
Thanks for having me.
It's been a volatile week in digital assets. The president he posted on Truth Social on Sunday about a strategic crypto reserve that would include Bitcoin, ETH, XRP, ADA, and SOL. But crucially, he tweeted or posted first about XRP, ADA, and SOL, and then later followed up with, of course, he said, obviously also Bitcoin and ETH. Anyway, that sent coin prices a lot higher, but by Monday, midday, they'd mostly retraced the entire move. And then now, all the way back down into the mid to low 80s for Bitcoin. But yet now we're in the high 80s, and let's just start there. I don't know. What was your reaction to that? We'll talk about macro too, which continues to be tricky.
Yeah, I have taken a pretty cautious stance on the strategic crypto reserve. I think there are some kind of moral hazards with, purchasing, something like Cardano, Ripple, and Solana with taxpayer money and Bitcoin and ETH as well. I think if you're a president that is actively trying to, cut spending in the U.S. and you're cutting employees, it's really tough to go turn around and be like, I'm going to go buy this magic internet money that's already worth, tens of billions of dollars. It's just a really hard pill to swallow. And I think, if you even think about kind of some of the Republican states that have Bitcoin legislation, like it hasn't been an easy path to pass, strategic Bitcoin reserves on a local and state level. And so, the idea of doing it on a federal level and expanding the scope beyond Bitcoin, I think is going to have a lot of pushback from basically all sides. So, I think that's kind of why you got the quick reversal. It's also worth keeping in mind that Sunday liquidity is pretty thin. And, the Truth Social headline dropped in a very illiquid period. And so that's kind of why you had some of these outsized moves, Cardano being up 75% on a weekend. Like, I don't think you would have had the same magnitude of a move if it was, Monday at 10 a.m., for example. Right. And so, that's partially explains the reversal you've had. The other thing to keep in mind in terms of why we've bounced since the fading of the weekend move is you do have the crypto summit, on Friday, and there are meaningful expectations, going into that meeting. But high level, I think what the market really needs is something more than words. Like, you need action, like signing a piece of paper or putting out a Truth Social post is not going to be enough to take crypto, meaningfully higher. I think you actually need to see either legislation passed by Congress or, like, even after that, like, you need to see dollars actually enter the crypto market in order to get that meaningful rally. And so, I think right now there's a lot of conjecture. and the market's ready for action.
Yeah, it was. I agree. The low liquidity, and I will talk a little bit about the summit, a little bit more about it. I think is interesting. This podcast obviously will come out on Thursday, March 6th. The summit will be on Friday, March 7th. We're recording on Wednesday, March 5th. But just looking at those assets that were mentioned in the Truth Social post, Cardano and XRP are still. Everything basically by end of day on Monday had retraced the full move, but Cardano and XRP are trading higher from pre-Truth Social post. Sol, Bitcoin, Sol and ETH are basically trading flat as if it never happened at this moment as we record at 10:30 a.m. Eastern on Wednesday. Bitcoin slightly higher than where it was, but basically, to me, this says something like, look, Bitcoin, ETH, and Sol are all, whether Bitcoin's slightly higher, they're basically flat. Bitcoin's slightly higher at the moment, but these are the actual liquid ones, much more liquid than XRP and Cardano. So it screams a liquidity story to me.
Yeah, no, I mean, there definitely is a little bit of a liquidity story to it, and kind of like, institutional ownership base versus like a retail ownership base dynamic as well. I think if you look at kind of the average balances of folks that hold Cardano and Ripple, I do think they tend to be smaller than, the majors. And so there's a bit of a dynamic there in terms of an ownership base. But the other most notable dynamic, though, is the relationship with broader risk markets, right? And equities in the U.S. have been trading super heavy. You're kind of at those, deep seek low kind of trading levels at the moment. And you're threatening, big support levels like, the 200-day moving average on S&P. And you've also just, and that's been driven by kind of a broader slowdown in the U.S. economy, which we touched on during the last podcast. But, that's a trend that no market can really ignore, particularly a risk asset like crypto.
Yeah. Are we in a risk off environment just generally right now, would you say?
I would say that for sure. If you take a step back, though, I do think you're kind of still in the early innings of it. Like the S&P, I think year to date is only off like 125 basis points, right? And if you read, Fin Twitter, like it would seem like the world is burning, but you really haven't moved that much. And if you take a step back and look at the 5-10 year charts of, basically any equity index, you're still at very, very elevated levels. And so, I think, I'm not calling for like a meaningful downturn, but another 5% in equity markets does not seem crazy to me.
Yeah, and it does feel, I was going to say there was new data, right? We had the ADP data, which came in soft, which is employment data, which jives with what you and we have been expecting, which is theoretically rising unemployment. Makes sense when you fire, tons of people from the world's biggest employer, which is the U.S. government, right?
Yeah. So I think, one, some of those firings have still yet to hit the data. And so, for example, when you look at, folks filing for initial like unemployment benefits and initial jobless claims in DC and Virginia, though they haven't really ticked up quite yet in a way that you'd like to see or, are expecting to see. So I still think that you have that federal workforce kind of tailwind that's upcoming. But, you're spot on. ADP came in the mid 70,000s versus expectations of 140,000. That's a reasonably reliable data point. The big jobs print is obviously going to be non-farm payrolls on Friday, and that should give you a better reading of kind of what the labor force, what's happening with the labor force.
And let's step back and think about the administration's policy a little bit, because it's Wednesday, March 5th, but yesterday, Tuesday night, March 4th, President Trump gave an address before a joint session of Congress, not technically a State of the Union address, but he did lay out a lot. And Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has also made clear, he said that they want lower rates. He said He and Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick have been very vocal and supportive of the tariff policy and strategy, I should even say. It almost seems to me like they know, and like that near-term pain is the strategy here, right? And in order to get down rates, get people into the longer end of the Treasury curve, right? Is that sort of like what it looks like to you?
It's quite possible. And, I do think Scott Bessent and Howard Lutnick are kind of smart enough to kind of have a strategy like that. And so it's definitely a believable thesis. But, if I was the president right now and I was thinking about the future of America 5, 10, 15 years out, like my first objective would be to get the fiscal situation corrected. And I think that's exactly what they're doing. They're cutting spending, cutting employment. They are, selling properties, as you saw. I don't know if you saw, they're selling 440 some odd commercial buildings. There's talk about monetizing the gold balances, things of that nature. And so they are actively trying to address the government's balance sheet. And one of the best ways to address the government balance sheet is to reduce the cost of borrowing. And so, yes, it's an entirely plausible thesis, and it probably would be exactly what I would do if I was, trying to govern well for the long run.
Yeah, interesting. Well, let's leave it there this week. It continues to be very interesting. There is this, after this show will have been published, there is this summit at the White House. They're calling it the first crypto summit, involving some key executives from the crypto industry. Obviously, urge our listeners to follow that. There could be news emanating from that or something that could affect markets. Of course, though, we will cover whatever it is that will happen in that next week when we see you back here, Beimnet, my friend. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Let's go now to our guest, Jake Chervinsky, Chief Legal Officer at Variant Fund, former Chief of Policy at the Blockchain Association. Jake, thank you so much for coming on Galaxy Brains.
Awesome to be here, Alex. Thanks for having me.
You had a disclaimer you want to get out of the way right at the top here before we start?
Yes. My usual disclaimer. I am a lawyer, but I'm not your lawyer, and I do not represent anyone listening, so nothing I say here is intended as a legal advice or financial advice either.
Well, I'm really excited to have you on, Jake. I followed you for a long time as a prominent and thoughtful voice in the area of digital assets policy. And this is the golden era of digital assets policy making, right?
It is, yeah. And likewise, I've been following you, and I think you and I have both been talking about this and following it for a long time. So it's nice to catch up with you in this bold, brave new world we're in. Yeah,
it feels like the boot is finally off crypto's neck. That doesn't mean crypto's ready to win. I hope crypto will win. But finally, it doesn't look like the primary impediment is going to be the U.S. government, at least.
I mean, that's my main impression. And the same thing for all the founders that I work with is just, we actually have a pathway to run this experiment and see what is this technology good for. And whereas the last administration was trying to ban crypto in the guise of regulation, now we're having a real conversation about what does good regulation look like. It's not a guarantee crypto wins, but at least we've got a shot.
It's super complicated, it turns out, when the government across various independent agencies like the SEC and CFTC or in the DOJ or in the Treasury or wherever didn't do any work on this, basically just took an antagonistic posture. I don't know, maybe just because we had Commissioner Peirce on this show 2 or 3 weeks ago, and I know you and I for sure followed the commissioner for a long time. I've been really struck with one of the things, other than the fact that she and her team at the Crypto Task Force at the SEC are really buckling down. We can talk about that. But almost her sense of relieved exasperation at the state of affairs. She's obviously expressing relief that the tide has turned and that now she and other true intellectuals can try to figure this thing out. But also how complicated the pile that was left her. Her last... She in a statement on February 4th, The Journey Begins, she talked about the need to disentangle all of these things. And then her last statement, I think on February 21st, was called, "There must be some way out of here." It's almost like, oh crap, look at all this stuff.
It's a huge amount. And I just want to give her credit for doing so much already, right? We're 6 weeks into the new administration. They've already done so much. She's defined what the issues are. The SEC has walked away, truly turned around and walked away from this campaign of regulation by enforcement to try to destroy the industry. It's extraordinary to see how much progress there has been in that short period of time. There's no person we could want more than Hester Peirce to be in charge of this effort. I do want to say I've seen some people complaining that she hasn't solved it all yet. And it's like, she just got started. Let's give her some time to figure this out. This stuff is super complicated. And yes, we've been talking about it for a long time, but it is really hard to figure out when you actually have to put together some kind of regulatory framework for this stuff, what it should actually look like. And this is a challenge for her and also for the industry, where we've just been saying no for years, right? A proposed ban comes up and we say no. Really easy to do that. It's our job now to get on the same page about what we want. And if we can't figure that out, then how can we expect her or anybody else in government to?
Yeah, it's almost like she's broken the lock off the basement door. It's like in the Raiders of the Lost Ark, where there's the giant warehouse with all the stuff, but the lights are out and she's carrying a flashlight and the flashlight's running out of batteries, and she's begging for help. Please explain, and don't come to me with principled frameworks for regulation. Please tell me exactly how the rule needs to be adapted. Like, I need language substitutional edits here.
Yeah, exactly. And also, she can't do it alone. Very much to your point, she's asking for help. She just staffed up at the task force, right? I mean, she was working with only a few people for the first, month or so of the administration. One awesome bit of news for all of us is that the chief counsel for the crypto task force is a lawyer named Mike Seelig, who was previously at Wilkie Farr and Gallagher. Phenomenal lawyer, deeply understands these issues. So I think as he ramps up and as they keep taking meetings with industry and getting real input on, what the right priorities are and how to tackle them, we're going to see good progress. But also, no one should underestimate how long it's going to take to figure this out. This is a multi-year process, right? We're going to be talking about this for a really long time.
Yeah, and to your point about them moving quickly on ending the regulation by enforcement, right? We've seen some of the easier things they can do is pause or halt enforcements and litigation. They've done that in mass. So, I mean, for the last 2-3 weeks, it's been almost every day or every other day. Either an entity that received a Wells notice, which is an intent to sue by the SEC, or was under investigation, has come out and said that investigation's been dropped, or they've even gone into court, or the commission has voted to go into court and formally end proceedings. That type of relief is fast. The rulemaking part is complicated.
Totally. And honestly, it's gone faster than many of us expected. Usually there is continuity between administrations, even when you have a change from one party control to the other, where the commission wants to say, look, maybe we were a little bit too aggressive before, so we'll, work out a settlement, some kind of safe phasing way out of the position that they're in. This is not what the commission did. They basically just said, yeah, we were totally wrong. We're walking away from all this stuff. SAB 121 is another example, where very quickly it was just like, that was wrong. We're walking away from that now. We're sort of running out of those, day one, month one victories. And now it's like, let's get in the trenches and let's really figure out what we can do. That's going to take time.
It's great. I love that they came out with the overturn or clarification, however you want to say. The fixing of SAB 121 was SAB 122. And actually, they hadn't done another staff accounting bulletin in the SEC since March 31st, 2022, when SAB 121 was issued. I agree. We're getting to the point where some of the low-hanging fruit is now been picked, and now we got to, try to chop down the whole tree. Let's step back a little bit. The SEC, this stuff at the SEC, incredibly important. Obviously, I think an underlying reason for withdrawing or lawsuits that they had brought or halting or pausing enforcements is that so much of it flowed from the view of what is and isn't a security that the SEC had said. And while Chair Gensler was at MIT before then, he said something like 99% or most of them are commodities. Then when he was chair of the SEC, he literally said the opposite, that I forget which one was 99% or which one was most of them, but that they were all basically securities and most of them unregistered securities, except for Bitcoin was the only one he ever actually said was not a security. And that is the foundation from which all else securities law claims flows into the SEC, right? You can't be an unregistered national securities exchange like Coinbase was being alleged to be if the things on that you're trading aren't securities, right? And you can't have done an unregistered security offering if the thing that you sold wasn't a security. So at the core is a rethinking of that issue, right?
Yeah, and I think also revisiting this question of whether you apply the investment contract analysis to the asset, right, the token itself, or the transaction in which the token is sold or transferred. And this is a major point of dispute, especially in the Coinbase case, where Gary Gensler's view was the token is the security. And then, of course, they had to sort of walk that back. They were like, well, that's not really what we mean. We mean that the token represents this like bundle of things that then is the security. But the way that the industry has always interpreted this is the Howey test applies to transactions. It doesn't apply to assets. And so you may want to regulate, if you're the SEC, the initial sale of an asset, right? Like an ICO in the form of a fundraising event for capital formation to fund the project on the promise of profit if the project goes well. Okay, that transaction is very likely a securities transaction. Doesn't mean that that asset involved in the transaction itself is a security. And I think this is going to be a big point that the SEC is going to try to clarify. But the other thing, though, that I think we're looking for clarity on, and I believe is the priority for the crypto task force, is figuring out how the creator of one of these tokens can create and distribute the token in compliance with the securities laws. So you're not in this sort of guessing game of like, well, my counsel for $200,000 gives me advice that says it doesn't look like an investment contract, but I'm never really going to know what the SEC thinks unless they come after me. But rather to have some kind of safe harbor, some compliant pathway to get the token into the world. And that's what I would expect the crypto task force is going to spend most of its time figuring out.
Yeah, agreed. And then, of course, how the existing, if they are a security or if it's an investment contract selling a non-security but should be regulated, what venues, what disclosures, all of that stuff. I think very interesting. All right, now I'm actually going to step back a little bit from the SEC. All of that stuff at the SEC is primarily related to the issuance and trading of either things that are securities or might be sold in a securities transaction. But there is a lot more going on and important in crypto. Obviously, for example, just as a high level, none of that involves something like Bitcoin and not like Ether today. But it may involve other things like new issuances and the markets where tokens can trade. But there are many other issues. So like one of the biggest ones is how to treat under various parts of the law or jurisdictions non-custodial things, whether it's like a Uniswap that is a genuinely non-upgradable contract, or even Tornado Cash, which itself was not upgradable, although there may be fees and other features or whatever, or even just straight up like Bitcoin Core or like a core Ethereum wallet, right? Like Geth client, right? Software developers that merely put tools out into the world. There's a lot of issues. I don't think they are issues, lowercase issues, but there are a lot of policy issues that revolve around questions around this, key segment of the industry, right? Non-custodial stuff is sort of in what you could say is the core innovation of public blockchains. I know you think a lot about this. A lot of this involves the Bank Secrecy Act and FinCEN or like sanctions at OFAC or a variety of things. Where do you want to start this conversation? I know it's very important to you.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you bring it up. I do think this is maybe the most existential issue still facing crypto. And the financial markets regulatory issues like the SEC issues, look, it's going to be hard to figure out, but we know that the government wants to figure these issues out in a way that works for crypto. We really haven't gotten the same signals for a lot of these issues around money transmission and the creation of non-custodial software. And just maybe to give folks who are new to this issue a little bit of the history. So FinCEN, which is the bureau at the Treasury Department that interprets and enforces the Bank Secrecy Act, has done a really amazing job for almost 12 years now, giving guidance on who it believes is and who is not a financial institution regulated by the Bank Secrecy Act in crypto. And they sort of wrapped up their guidance in 2019, where they explained that an entity that does not take custody of user assets is not a money transmitter and does not need to register and do anti-money laundering compliance. In other words, does not need to do customer due diligence, KYC as we think about it, right? Collecting personal identifying information from users. And this was basically how the entire industry sort of understood the concept of money transmission. Provided that we do not have control of user assets, then we do not need to identify users of our technology. The Department of Justice, about a year and a half ago, blew this out of the water in its case against the founders of Tornado Cash, a privacy-preserving protocol built on Ethereum. And basically, what DOJ said was, we do not care what guidance Treasury gave under Title 31 of the US Code, the Bank Secrecy Act. We are enforcing a totally different statute, 18 United States Code Section 1960, so in Title 18, the Criminal Code, which is the criminal penalty for operating an unlicensed money transmitting business. And DOJ basically says, we don't really care what FinCEN thinks money transmission is. We don't agree that control of user funds is necessary for money transmission. In our interpretation, you can be an unlicensed money transmitting business if you create software that allows users to cause a transfer of funds, even if you do not have control of those funds. And if you do not register with FinCEN, despite the fact that FinCEN doesn't want you to register with them, then you are in violation of a criminal statute. You go to prison for 5 years. And that is the indictment that they levied against Roman Storm and the other founders of Tornado Cash. DOJ has not walked away from this position. So they're taking Roman Storm to trial in a month. And I guess the last thing I'd say in this diatribe about this issue is, if we can't solve that problem, if it is the case that developing non-custodial software means you are an unlicensed money transmitting business with no way to comply because there's no way for you to identify the users of that non-custodial software, then there's no crypto in the United States. And this is something that we need DOJ to address if really and truly the US is going to be the crypto capital of the world.
Yeah, it doesn't really matter what the SEC thinks is and isn't a security if operating a Bitcoin node, which by the way it's obviously non-custodial for, it's maybe custodial for you, the operator, but Bitcoin nodes do relay transactions to the network, or more concretely, a Bitcoin miner or an Ethereum validator, which do effectively cause transactions to be put on the blockchain and therefore executed and settled, or a developer of Bitcoin Core or Geth or any Ethereum Core software, which are just for free on GitHub. If you can't operate those without registering, then you can't run public blockchains in the United States. It does feel existential.
All that is exactly right. And the list goes on and on and on. So RPC node operators, right, who in some way are helping to put transactions on a blockchain, non-custodial, but nonetheless, they would fall under this definition. Providers of wallet software, right? The wallet will allow someone to make a transaction. The provider of the wallet is just a software developer. It's non-custodial. They get captured by this definition. The provider of a DeFi front end, right? If you want to use Uniswap, for example, and you go to their online application, they don't take custody of your funds. Nonetheless, DOJ could say under this theory that they are an unlicensed money transmitting business. And so this is just one of these issues where, number one, it doesn't work for crypto, so it has to get solved. And number two, it's fundamentally unfair to have two different departments of the same federal government saying opposite things about what is essentially the same law, just on the technicality that one definition is in Title 18 and the other definition is in Title 31. If builders cannot rely on the Treasury Department, there's just no way this industry can succeed in this country.
Yeah, and the enforcement of effectively the statute to which DOJ says Tornado Cash was non-compliant is delegated to FinCEN. That is its job.
Yes. And I wrote a 40-page paper with Amanda Tuminelli, the chief legal officer at the DeFi Education Fund, and my colleague Dan Barabander at Variant, analyzing this statute, Section 1960, to explain exactly what it means and what the right legal interpretation of it is. And one thing that we discovered was plenty of congressional legislative history basically saying Section 1960 is the enforcement mechanism for the Bank Secrecy Act. So the idea that you would interpret it as having a different meaning of the concept concept of money transmission than the Bank Secrecy Act, it makes no sense at all. It's an artifact, again, of a different administration that was trying to ban this industry under the guise of asking for compliance with regulation. But this is not a workable theory. And so we need the Trump administration to reverse course on that, just like the SEC has already reversed course on so much else.
Yeah, it is. That one is very dangerous. And this was also this sort of view of enforcing through ostensibly through anti-terrorism or for money laundering was the basis of a lot of Senator Elizabeth Warren's critiques over the last 4 years or however long. She had proposed a bill, the Digital Assets Anti-Money Laundering Act, which did, I think, specifically enhance and widen the interpretation of the Bank Secrecy Act to specifically include all of these types of people, right? So that in the absence of that authority, which of course that bill did not pass, DOJ appeared to have gone it alone on at least this part of that issue. Do you think we need some kind of I mean, I don't know. How do we remedy this? Can DOJ, like either can the Treasury Department yell at the DOJ, or can the Attorney General, what are the mechanics of actually rolling this back? Or do we need some kind of legislation to clarify this?
It's a great question. And I guess what I would say is, in a perfect world, we would have the most durable policy solution possible. And that's legislation, because it means that the next administration couldn't come in and just decide to reverse course on whatever this administration decided, right? So if DOJ just drops the case against Roman Storm and also against the developers of Samurai Wallet, who are being charged with essentially the exact same theory, well, the next DOJ could just say, oh, those guys were wrong. We're going to go back to the original interpretation. So what you want is something that you can actually rely on. Legislation is the best way to do this. There is actually a proposal called the Blockchain Regulatory Certainty Act. And that's one way to clarify that under the Bank Secrecy Act, developers of non-custodial software are not intended to be money transmitters. So that's one way that you could try to get to this issue. You could also try to just amend Section 1960 itself to clarify the definition of money transmission, although frankly, it seems pretty clear on its face to me and to many other lawyers. But barring that, what you would want is some statement from the Department of Justice, ideally jointly between DOJ and Treasury, saying this is our joint interpretation of what money transmission means. And that way developers could rely on that statement under principles of due process and fair notice to say, look, you told us what we were allowed to do, so you can't prosecute us for doing exactly what you said was okay.
Yeah, it does make sense just in general. The money transmission regulations, to me, and I did some research on this a while ago, but maybe correct me if I'm wrong here, but they were created because historically money transmission, before the internet, before even before the telegram, was you walking up to somebody in point A, giving them cash, and then your recipient walking up to that person's associate in point B and receiving cash, and then the network of those two intermediaries settling, that's their business, right? They charge you for the settlement of that, but there was a high risk, obviously, that you give money to point A and the point B doesn't pay out your recipient. They could abscond with the funds. And that's the sort of core reason, in my view, why money transmitters are regulated, so that doesn't happen. But that underlying feature, the ability to control and thus abscond with the user funds, is impossible for a non-custodial piece of technology.
You're so right. And let me drive home how right you are. So yes, originally the money transmission laws in the states were designed to stop the money transmitter, an intermediary with control of customer funds, from running away with those funds. And that's why state regulation requires things like posting bonds to make sure that there's not financial incentive for the intermediary to steal customer funds. But the thing is, because of this type of relationship, the money transmitter had access to information about its customers, right? And who its customers were. It had legal relationships with them. And so it was reasonable in 1970 for the federal government to pass the Bank Secrecy Act and say, look, if you have this information already, then you're going to have to keep it and you're going to have to report it to us so that we can track money laundering and other illicit financial activity. But the problem is, Crypto does not depend on intermediaries. So we live in this new world where there is not a middleman who has information about customers in a transaction that they can turn over, right? Users are not customers. But because law enforcement has become so dependent on tracing the money and using this information that's turned over to the government through what is frankly a massive web now of warrantless financial surveillance over people's transactions, the sort of knee-jerk reaction to crypto is, let's just apply the same requirements here, and let's force people who are not otherwise intermediaries to play the role of an intermediary, to collect information they would not otherwise have, and be deputized into this role of financial surveillance. And the point of crypto is to avoid all of that. And so the question does become, how do we address in legislation the very real and valid concerns that policymakers have about illicit financial activity in the system? We could talk about the Beimnet hack and the Lazarus Group, making a huge payday off of that vulnerability. But we need to do that in a way that also preserves privacy, and that's where the challenge is.
Yeah, I just want to highlight further what you said. I know you know of this tweet from our friend Niraj Agrawal at Coin Center. It's an iconic, famous tweet, maybe the single best tweet ever about the impact of disintermediated open blockchains on financial surveillance. Niraj, in January of 2021, he tweeted, "I'm sorry that your warrantless surveillance regime was built on the assumption that people would always need intermediaries to transact." There's a lot there, but I think one of the principles that you mentioned that I really think is important, and I try to emphasize to policymakers, not just on this issue, but on all of the crypto and digital asset policy issues, is to please approach the world as it exists. And this is now a world where public blockchains exist. It's just a fact. You can try to regulate it out of existence. It's going to be like water on pavement. You're not putting that cat back in the box or whatever the phrase is, right? Like, and so your point about how to deal, because it's hard to make the argument for privacy and policy, right? Like, we've got this post 9/11 financial surveillance train is really hard to stop. Even in this administration, I fear and think it will be difficult to roll back. Like, what is the argument? I mean, because you could say, like, okay, maybe we can use zero knowledge technology to, allow it to be private while still letting like the government or something, or at least an intermediary that can like unmask a transaction, some newfangled technology solution. But like, Bitcoin and Ethereum aren't going to add that at the protocol level. Like, there will always be at this point non-custodial, non-intermediated transactions, right? Like, do we have a real answer for that, or do we need to update the BSA?
I mean, look, this is tough, and I guess I'd tell you there are sort of three answers that the industry has been using so far, and maybe none of them are perfectly satisfying, but just to give folks a sense of where the conversation is. The first is what you just said, which is, this is just the world now. I'm sorry that you don't like it. Maybe we don't like some aspects of it as well, but it is how it is, and you can't bury your head in the sand and hope that it's going to go back to some other way. This is frankly the same with literally every technology in existence, right? From the invention of electricity to the automobile, to the internet, to public blockchains. What you have to do is reckon with reality. And even if it means you have to adapt to it, that is what you have to do. You have to adapt. The sort of second answer is that this is a net good, right? Even for folks who may be afraid of the idea of private transactions, who think it is a net positive for government to have surveillance and to, sort of be able to censor or surveil all of these types of transactions. Everyone has some instance in which they can identify with the idea of an authoritarian or dictatorial regime, maybe not in the US, maybe in some other country, that is discriminating against something that they care about. And this has actually, I think, come home for a whole lot of people recently in a number of different instances. But one sort of issue that's resonated a lot with folks is the idea of a central bank digital currency recreating something like the social credit system that's in place in China under the Chinese Communist Party. What we don't want is for any government where there is strong central authority to be able to discriminate in that way by, for example, tracing people of Uyghur Muslim origin and then putting them into re-education camps because they are able to surveil all of their transactions. So there are really strong arguments from a privacy perspective for basically any audience who's open to hearing it. The third argument, though, is also one that you mentioned about zero knowledge proofs, which is, look, this just gives us a way to do this better. we can still have some surveillance and some tracing of transactions, but we don't have to have that in a system where every person hands over all of their personal identifying information, the most sensitive information in their lives, to a single very large financial institution, which odds are has very bad cybersecurity practices and is almost certainly going to get hacked. And all of that information goes into a single central point of failure that's a honeypot for bad guys to come after. This is obviously not working, and so we can do it better.
Yeah, I agree. Even separate from literally blockchains, a more secure identity system needs to be constructed because, I mean, think about it. You go and buy something on Shopify, you got to give pretty much all your information to some random store, like literally some, a direct to consumer brand might have all your info. There's no, doesn't really make sense that your info is everywhere. And of course, we know the really big honeypots like the credit bureaus, right? Equifax hack exposed basically every single American that has credit. The government, the Office of Personnel Management hack was one of the most devastating hacks in U.S. government history. Something like the personnel records of every single U.S. government employee, including like covert agents, was exposed. So I think I have seen just maybe there is a slight turn. I don't know since the Trump inauguration, if like where the status of this is, but it did actually feel like, at least from a cybersecurity standpoint, the U.S. government was starting to say, you know what, wait a second, actually our individual citizens' privacy not being violated by foreign actors is at least a national security concern.
I think that's true, and I do think it's shifting. And I think it's one of those things where for a very long time, the US government was opposed to end-to-end encryption, right? This is like all the way back to the 1990s in the original crypto wars, where the government thought that encryption itself was a threat, right? That wanted to treat that type of software as a munition. And if you fast forward to, recent times, especially with these compromises of government systems, there is some recognition now that encryption is just necessary to be safe in a digital world. And there was even a statement, I forget now which agency put it out, it might have been the NSA or the FBI, encouraging people to use end-to-end encryption in their messaging. And that's just a massive shift. And I think it's a positive one, and hopefully that'll continue in the future.
Yeah, I think that's the one I was referencing as well, which felt like a bit of a shift. Not necessarily a whole of government approach to the shift, but for years, I mean, yes, going back to Phil Zimmerman and PGP, later with the Clipper chip, the Clinton administration was suggesting putting a literal piece of spyware hardware in every electronic device. I think at the time it was televisions they were suggesting, but it was everything. Then the San Bernardino shooter's iPhone, there's a whole saga about that with the government where Apple refused to help, but then separately, apparently the government figured it out. Who knows how? Apple had designed a huge multi-year marketing campaign on how they protect privacy, which was positive. I can't speak to how true that is, but certainly people do want to be private. I think that's right. Now there's this thing in the UK where, in the UK, by the way, just granted, I am born and raised in New England, so I have to admit I am extremely biased against the British. American history, when you grow up in New England, is basically 15 years of being told how British soldiers killed your ancestors, literally. Probably walked the Freedom Trail 15 years in a row. But the UK, I'm going to come out and say it is an absolute hellhole for privacy from the government. It is a fully surveilled, very Orwellian society at this point. And they just did this thing with the iPhone and the encrypted data in the cloud. So the world is going one way on this, and I hope we can be smart and go the other. To me, it's kind of to Niraj's tweet. It's like the entire thing is based on the idea that we can just surveil everything all the time, when in reality, law enforcement is just going to have to catch people finally again and make law enforcement great again. Let them actually catch the people. And instead of just sending subpoenas to every bank that they find the name of. And by the way, blockchains are great for tracing transaction flows. You might not be able to seize and acquire the funds when you identify their destination, but I mean, we've seen myriad instances of Bitcoins and Ether recovered by government after tracing it and sitting on it.
Totally. And I guess what I'll say is, well, first of all, I'm born and raised in Massachusetts, so I empathize with you on that. I did plenty of tours of Lexington and Concord, and so I have
Yeah.
similar feelings about our friends over in the UK. Although I do love them.
Yes,
But I
I'm
do
mostly
think
just
it's
poking those guys, but yes.
for sure. And look, they've also in some ways been really pro crypto, and this I think is just a huge mistake. And I think what happens, and this is true for Bitcoin more than many other types of assets and also industries, is global competition between different jurisdictions and geographies and how they regulate technology. And I think, when a jurisdiction tries to overregulate in this way, they suffer for it. And at this point they suffer very quickly because it's very easy for companies to decide to just block a jurisdiction or, withdraw products and services at the drop of a dime. And so I think it is the countries that are more embracing of innovation, including innovation in privacy, that are going to benefit the most from that type of business. That's a hope that I have for the United States right now with this administration. And, we could, I'm sure, point out a lot of the pros and cons of, what we're expecting from the administration in terms of their focus. But I think very clearly there is a strong sense in this administration that encouraging business and entrepreneurship is a priority. And so I don't think that there's going to be a whole of government attempt to adopt something like Elizabeth Warren's Digital Asset Anti-Money Laundering Act, which again was a ban on crypto in the guise of anti-money laundering regulation, right? It said Bitcoin nodes have to identify all the users of Bitcoin or they can't operate in the US. That's obviously not possible. So I think that we will ultimately have to come up with, like you said, some type of system in which law enforcement can still do their job. Good old fashioned police work. I trust our law enforcement to do that. And, if that means that there's some regulation about the most private systems having some type of way to, even in an opt-in or voluntary sense, for, folks to be able to provide information to law enforcement, well, maybe there's going to be regulation like that. And there's obviously always going to be the unregulated black market, can't be stopped. But I do think we're sort of moving toward a world where there is compromise that allows this technology to thrive in the US.
Yeah, I think that's right. We could go on and on about this issue, which I agree. I'm really happy we talked about. I think at the top you said it. Some of the bad policy ideas emanating from this issue can be existential, truly, to crypto. So, and by the way, like we've talked about too, it's privacy and individual liberty as well. Not just sort of a how does crypto do its thing, but also real, true, fundamental human freedom questions. I do want to pivot a little bit before we wrap. This podcast is going to come out. So we're recording on March 5th, Wednesday. This audio will have dropped Thursday, March 6th, and video will drop on Friday, March 7th. On Friday, March 7th, though, there is this summit at the White House of, I don't know, they're calling it the Crypto Summit. And, we don't know exactly who will be there, but it's some cross-section of industry executives and the American crypto industry executives, I think it's fair to say. I don't know. I want to ask you about that and also about a post you made on the great website x.com about why Ethereum should go to Washington. I think perhaps emanating from the expectation that there is not a sort of core Ethereum invitee to this summit, but also something maybe a little bit bigger. But before we get directly to that, what is sort of your impression of the any part of the sort of White House's messaging, whether it's David Sachs or if it's Trump's Truth Social posts or if it's the event of these types of summits? I mean, how should people be thinking about what the White House really is doing on these issues? And then we'll talk about Ethereum specifically.
Well, yeah, I guess maybe a few quick thoughts. At the highest level, I would say this is extraordinarily positive. We have a White House that, first of all, picked crypto and AI czar David Sachs, who is clearly committed to innovation in America and understands, I think, pretty deeply what we're trying to do in the crypto industry. And we have a White House that wants to engage with industry in this way. So I think it's just extraordinarily positive that we have something like this summit. I think when you look into the details, and we only know at this point only so much about what might be announced there and who the attendees might be, but it seems like the focus right now is first of all, on just getting people around a table to have a conversation about what's most important. I think that's really positive. The White House for the last 4 years wasn't really interested or open to meeting with industry. So to have a wide group of people come and just have that kind of discussion with the people who are really in charge of figuring this out, David Sachs, obviously the president, also Bo Hines, who's been doing some really great work on this, I think that's super positive. The rumors about what might be announced, I guess I would say, raise a little bit more of a question for me. So there's been 2 rumors so far. We'll see which, if either of them are true. One is that we're going to get news about this strategic crypto reserve. The other is that we will get an announcement about an effort to eliminate capital gains taxes on crypto sales. And I'll just tell you my own personal opinion, which is I don't think either of these should be the priority for the US. To me, what we need to do is we need to create a regulatory framework that allows the technology to thrive and allows everyone in the country to feel good from a regulatory perspective getting involved. That means stablecoin legislation, and it means market structure legislation. And I would love for the White House to be more focused on those issues. And so hopefully something will come from the summit around the priorities there.
It does seem like the reserve something is gonna emanate from on that topic, partly because of the events of this week, the Truth Social post on Sunday and posts, and then some industry backlash. I mean, really from prominent non-Bitcoin maxi cryptocurrency executives, but also it's the market. Mr. Market is demanding information on this, not necessarily Mr. Alex and Jake policy people, but Mr. Market is pressuring the White House on clarifying and confirming its role on this. The cap gains thing I saw, I actually think this is, I think it's most likely just false trolling, that that this didn't come from anywhere and it's crypto people. I know, what's this guy, the Carbon Based, like months ago had specifically made this up as a troll, and it gets recycled like every couple weeks. So I agree, those should not be the priority at all. I do think, let's talk a little bit about the legislation actually that you brought up. Then we'll get to your post about Ethereum and its role in a policymaking world, because as a decentralized protocol, in this case, at least, knock on wood, my Bitcoin maxi friends might be upset that I'm saying this, not dissimilar from Bitcoin. No clear CEO. Sure, there's a foundation and the founders aren't anonymous, but, isn't organized the way later launched protocols are. But let's talk about the market structure and the stablecoins. Let's start with stablecoins. I would love to know your impression. I'm going to throw something out here, and let's see what you take from it. It feels a little bit to me, the common sort of refrain is that stablecoins are easier than market structure. That's why it'll go first, that there's more bipartisan support behind it. And I kind of think this is a little bit like blockchain, not Bitcoin, from like the 2015 era. You're like, look, market structure it could be tricky, it's complicated, but also there's all these winners and losers. And if I vote for it, I may be seen as being, if I'm on the fence or a crypto skeptic, I may be seen as supporting meme coins or scams or whatever bad things that crypto has done. I'll be seen as legalizing those. But stable coins, that's about like banks and stuff and the dollar and treasuries. That doesn't seem as controversial. But actually, I think stable coins are significantly more disruptive and a much bigger idea for the US government than what is kind of a crypto market niche issue, which is whom should regulate what. What's your take on that statement? I could be wrong, certainly. That's just sort of how I've been thinking about it.
It's hard to say. I do think you're wrong, unfortunately. Although I like your take. It feels contrarian, and I want to agree with you, but I don't think you're right. I do think stablecoins are easier. Let me tell you why I think that, although I think you make a couple of good points worth addressing as well. Basically, a stablecoin is just a liability from an entity that is holding an asset behind that liability. It's a very simple business model. We understand very well how to regulate it. And so that, I think, is what makes stablecoin legislation easier, in the sense that the regulatory requirements are not that difficult to figure out. It's not like, for example, what we were just discussing, that the SEC has to figure out what the compliant pathway is for issuing new tokens. It's not some brand new novel concept. It's I think, actually fairly easy to figure out what the right regulations are. I also think it's easier in the sense that stablecoins are, whether you like them or not, and some of our Bitcoin maxi friends will not like this because they think Bitcoin should be the global reserve currency, not the dollar. But stablecoins are an obvious upgrade on the current financial system for the transmission of US dollars globally. It's one of those things that is just an inarguable use case for a public blockchain. It's just better. It's faster, it's more efficient, and it's more accessible. So it's one of those things where in my own conversations with policymakers, when they're like, what is the use of any of this stuff that you're talking about and dealing with in crypto? Stablecoins are the one thing that they all understand. And that I think makes it easier to get done because Congress does really understand this is not only an upgrade, but also that it's good for US dollar dominance globally. And that's something that obviously many people in DC are really focused on doing. The reason though that I think what you said has some validity is that there are some very specific entrenched interests, both inside the crypto industry and outside of it, who have a huge stake in how stablecoin legislation comes out. And we could talk a little bit, if you want to get deep into the weeds, about the difference between the Stable Act in the House and the Genius Act in the Senate, right? The two sort of competing, coordinating stablecoin bills. But there are a couple of really small seeming landmines in those bills that could make them undoable in DC. And so just because we're saying stablecoins are easier doesn't mean it's easy at all. It's really hard to get anything done in Washington.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think to me, it's more like the impact of, I agree, I think they are politically easier and easier to understand and undeniably positive, not just for dollar dominance, but also as a buyer of US debt, which is sorely needed. So I think it's great policy. I do think it has the likelihood, frankly, a US dollar denominated stablecoin explosion of dramatically disrupting the banking system, which I'm not necessarily saying is a bad thing. I'm just saying I'm not sure that the Congress has thought as deeply as they might, given I think how unbelievably massive the stablecoin idea really is.
Yeah, and I think like there's sort of two phases to this, and I say this in the context that these two bills, the Stable and Genius Acts, they're maybe like 95% consistent. I mean, there's differences and it's meaningful. It'll take time to work out, but a lot of it really is figured out. The sort of first question is, can industry get on the same page? Because if the industry can't get on the same page and push in the same direction, never going to happen. So first, it requires industry to get on the same page. I won't get super deep into the weeds of what is essentially a battle between Circle and Tether, as you might expect, over some of the seeming minutiae, but actually really important elements of the bill. But let's imagine that industry gets on the same page. The next question is, what does the banking lobby do? Because if the Bank Policy Institute shows up and says, yeah, nice stablecoin bill you got there, but we need one tweak, which is only banks are able to issue stablecoins, no non-bank issuers can be allowed, then that's also going to be a huge problem. And I think at this point, it's rather unclear what the banking lobby is going to do. They're keeping their powder dry. They're saying that they are in favor of stablecoin legislation for now, I think, because they don't want to cause trouble where none is necessary. But I think just to your point, this thing could get derailed pretty quickly. And as the saying goes in DC, there's 10,000 ways to kill a bill, and there's only one way for it to get done. So we'll just have to see what happens.
Yeah, I agree that it is. I just think it's more complicated than it's typically thought of. But I do think committee leadership in Congress knows that. I mean, they're well aware of that. And I do think it could be extremely positive. I mean, anyone that's even done a domestic ACH, not even a domestic wire, not even an international wire, I think will know, and has also transacted with stablecoins, like they're better. They're just better, whether you're doing it or your bank's doing it on your behalf. I mean, in either case, I do an ACH pull from one of my own accounts to another of my own accounts, and I don't see it sometimes for days, and it's just gone, right? I mean, so I think it is obviously a clear technology upgrade with other myriad benefits. All right, let's talk about lobbying in Washington, because you had this great post about, and the very first thing was, yes, Ethereum should go to Washington. And, you know, I encourage people to check it out on Jake's x.com page. Jake Chervinsky is Jake's handle, but maybe you could summarize what you're talking about here. And is Ethereum not already in Washington?
Ethereum is definitely in Washington. And I guess for context, this flows from the conversation we were just having about the crypto summit, that there's not really someone from the Ethereum world going to the summit, or at least that's been announced so far. We'll have to see what the guest list ends up being, just to advocate specifically for Ethereum. And you're right, Ethereum is definitely part of the policy conversation. First of all, there are many companies that are building in or around Ethereum. And so Ethereum is part of their interest. Whenever they are lobbying, they are thinking about what is good for Ethereum, because if they're not, then their business is going to fail. And also, Ethereum really is, in many ways, the most successful smart contract platform. We can certainly argue, different points and metrics about that, but Ethereum was on the scene before anybody else. And so when policymakers are asking about smart contract protocols, Ethereum just sort of is the canonical example that's given to explain what these things are and how they work. So there's a lot of discussion about Ethereum in Washington. The thing is, there isn't a single, very well-funded organization focused solely and exclusively on advancing the interests of Ethereum. And that is something that you do see for a lot of competing chains. And just to give you one example, I say this as just an objective fact, Ripple is one of the most influential, heaviest hitters in Washington. It's just a fact, no matter what you think about XRP or the company. They've been extraordinarily effective. And the reason that they've been so effective is because they have their own internal policy team. They've had that for many years, one of the first companies to be involved in DC. And they are very involved in the rest of the lobby. They're members of the Blockchain Association. They've helped to fund other nonprofits. And also, they are very involved in campaign finance and in political giving. So they were one of the 3 co-founders of Fairshake, which is crypto's super PAC. As many people know, the single largest super PAC in the entire 2024 election cycle, which had a lot of impact in favor of crypto. And you just don't see anything like that in the Ethereum ecosystem. What you have are these other companies that are either for-profit businesses that are advocating for their own products and services first and Ethereum second, as they should be doing, or other nonprofits that are advocating for Ethereum from a principled perspective, but not because they are pro-Ethereum, rather because they have this broader mandate to be in favor of decentralized technologies. And so what you're lacking in Ethereum is a really focused policy function like you have with so many other ecosystems that puts Ethereum at a disadvantage. And the reason why this is, not to go on, but just to put a fine point on it, I think is because of how the Ethereum world has thought about its own principles of decentralization and non-commerciality. This is how the Ethereum Foundation has always functioned. They are sort of positioned as above the fray. They delegate the sort of difficult, bloody work of trench warfare to other companies and don't want to get directly involved in that themselves. I'm not saying that necessarily has been the wrong decision, but it just puts them at a competitive disadvantage against other companies that have a traditional, tried and true government relations strategy, not just to benefit the industry, but to build a competitive advantage or a regulatory moat.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think Bitcoin suffers and has suffered from the same problem, but there is a great organization now, the Bitcoin Policy Institute. Humorously, also the acronym is BPI, like the Bank Policy Institute. And there isn't an Ethereum Policy Institute that I'm aware of. So Bitcoiners have kind of, and of course, they're, like, to your point, there are other great organizations that do good advocacy on behalf of the Bitcoin network. Coin Center is a clear one that does great advocacy for everyone, but including Bitcoins, put out stuff on Lightning Network and other stuff. But yes, there hasn't been, and but there is now. And Ethereum doesn't yet even have that. So I think it is reasonable to point out. It is much easier, by the way, if you're a giant equity company or labs organization that is behind a 2020 to present protocol launch, or even an earlier one, you mentioned Ripple, then if you're, and I guess I should even say, if you are in the ICO era, you're probably less likely to have a centralized policy org than you are if you're in the sort of venture coin era, because the ICOs, obviously there's a lot of, fraud during that era too, but the networks that did actually launch are significantly more decentralized than the networks that launched under the only token issuance regime that was allowed during the Gensler era, which was more of this private VC deal thing. So I agree. I see that it lacks that. Do you think, how's that going to change? Do you have a recommendation on the Ethereum side?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I've sort of two thoughts. One is just to say I think Bitcoin is in a league of its own. And I first of all, the Bitcoin Policy Institute, those guys are awesome, and I think they're doing phenomenal work. And they are very focused on Bitcoin, and they have all the right priorities. So that's great for Bitcoin. But Bitcoin was frankly fine before them, and I think that they would admit that, right? They're obviously moving the ball forward, but I think Bitcoin's just in a league of its own in a couple of different ways. First of all, it doesn't raise a lot of the same policy challenges that some of this other stuff does. Like you said, there aren't securities issues really that need to get worked out for Bitcoin. There's also just, I think, generally broader alignment among many people about Bitcoin's use case as decentralized money, right? Non-sovereign, non-state money, really different from all these other tech projects, which have, much more surface area for attack from policymakers. So I think it's just categorically different. In the context of Ethereum, I think what that means is Ethereum is unique in being so well established and still not having one of these types of functions. And the way that companies or foundations or ecosystems have funded this kind of work traditionally is through a treasury. And the Ethereum Foundation has a very large treasury. Now, I'm certainly in no position to tell anyone how to spend their money, but we are in this position in the industry where Ethereum is being challenged, frankly, in the same way I'm challenging them in the policy world. They're being challenged in the sort of commercial world, which is Ethereum is losing this battle with Solana, and we need to see, and other chains as well. And what people want to see who are supporters of Ethereum is a wartime Ethereum Foundation. And now there's this new organization, Etherealize, which is supposed to be taking up more the mantle of sort of this more competitive, commercial focused organization. And I guess my point is just, it's not that crazy to imagine taking some of those funds and committing them to a well-functioning, tried and true government relations strategy. This doesn't require reinventing the wheel. This isn't like coming up with some brand new cryptography or, some new consensus mechanism to scale a public blockchain or something like that. It's just like the blocking and tackling of the basic fundamentals of engaging with government in a way that gets you invited to the crypto summit this Friday. And I think that they should consider doing that.
Well, I think they should as well. And this has been a fascinating conversation, Jake. I encourage our listeners to follow Jake on Twitter, x.com, X, the app, formerly known as Twitter, J Chervinsky there, easy to find, Jake Chervinsky. And Jake, this has been great. Thank you so much for coming on Galaxy Brains.
Always fun. Thanks for having me.
That's it for this week's episode of Galaxy Brains. Thanks to our guest, Jake Chervinsky, Chief Legal Officer at Variant Fund, former Chief Policy Officer at the Blockchain Association. What a good conversation. So much happening in DC that affects this market. And of course, to our good friend, Beimnet Abebe from Galaxy Trading, as always. Everyone have a safe and happy weekend, and we will see you next week. Thanks for listening to Galaxy Brains, the weekly podcast from Galaxy Research. If you enjoy the show, please like, rate, review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. To follow Galaxy Research, sign up for our weekly newsletter at gdr.email, read our content at galaxy.com/research, and follow us on Twitter at GLXY Research. See you next week.